government believes in you.
None. The honourable member for Vermilion Lloydminster.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on Bill 2 this morning, and I certainly appreciated the comments from the honourable member for Calgary Northwest and acknowledge the work that she did in her capacity as a former Associate Minister for Family and Community Safety, and appreciate that work that was done. I will say, Madam Speaker, that this is a piece of legislation that I, too, am very much behind and very much in support of. This is the kind of thing that needs to be done in order to address a number of different concerns in the large and complex issue relating to domestic violence. And, I do commend the government for bringing this forward, and I certainly hope that it has the intended results as it is, designed to do. But what I want to talk about a little bit today, and I'm hoping that you will allow me a certain degree of latitude, and that is that while this is a good measure, as was the measure that was introduced by the member for Calgary Bow with regards to the breaking of residential tenancies leases, these are unfortunately measures that deal with the after effects, or at least deal with a response to an issue, a response to a problem. And, once again, borrowing on my medical background, I like to try to address root causes of problems. I like to try to drill down to, why did this get to this situation in the first place? And something that I'm not sure all members are aware of, I think at some level many members may be aware of this intuitively, but I'm going to bring forward some evidence and some results on some research that was done right here in Alberta, some outstanding research that was done right here in Alberta that talks about the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. And the reason I talk about it in this context, Madam Speaker, is because if we can do a better job of recognizing the early stages of those who are at risk of becoming abusers, of those who are potentially have a proclivity for domestic abuse, then perhaps we can address it at an earlier stage. Perhaps we can address these problems at an earlier stage. And I'm going to be quoting from a document entitled The Cruelty Connection, which was published in 2013. And this was it's entitled The Cruelty Connection, the relationship between animal cruelty, child abuse, and domestic violence. And it was published by our very own Alberta SPCA. And what is alarming, Madam Speaker, is some of the statistics that were found in the study that was done. Some 59% of abused women delayed leaving their home where abuse was occurring because of concern for their animals. Some 36% of abused women with animals reported that their abuser had threatened or harmed their animals. Some 85% of the threats against those animals were carried out. And further, 85% of the women where both children and animals reported that the children witnessed the threat or the harm to the animal, and in 50% of those cases, it was the child's own pet that was threatened or harmed. What makes these statistics even more shocking and more disturbing is that those numbers are tracked in other jurisdictions, and the numbers in Alberta are actually higher than what they are in other jurisdictions. The link between animal abuse and domestic violence is becoming increasingly recognized and increasingly acted upon, but I think in Alberta we have a tremendous opportunity to expand on that. Last spring, Madam Speaker, I attended a weekend-long seminar on animal forensics. Now, that's part of my requirement to keep up my veterinary license, which I have kept up. They say in politics you should always have a backup plan. And I have maintained my veterinary license, and I'm required to do 30 hours of continuing veterinary medical education every year. And so I signed up for this plan. Actually, it was my wife, who's also a veterinarian, who encouraged us to both sign up. We said it would be a wonderful weekend away in Calgary. I will tell you that it was perhaps one of the most difficult periods of continuing veterinary education that I've ever attended. the stories of animal abuse and the investigations by one of the leading world leaders in animal forensics that were presented there were disgusting. They were just absolutely heart-wrenching, the sorts of things that had happened to animals. And what makes it worse is that for most abusers, it is a very small step to then do the same to another human being. You know, there was a comment made at the end of one of our days when we were feeling particularly beat up. Our lecturer said to us, he says, you know, now we all need to go home and watch a Disney movie. Because it was that disturbing. And, you know, I will tell you, it was one of the most difficult things that I went through, but recognizing this link, I think, is important. But what is more important is what we can do about it. And what's encouraging is that, at least in the City of Calgary, there is cooperative work being done between the Calgary Police Service, the Calgary Humane Society, and the Calgary Shelters for Women. And that's encouraging because, for example, one of the problems we have is that most shelters in our province won't accept animals. So if you're in an abusive situation and are trying to escape, and your dog or your cat is also being abused, you can take your kids, but you can't take your dog or your cat. And for a lot of people, as I've said, for 59%, that delays their departure from that abusive situation. And that's a problem. You know, even more heart-wrenching in some ways than the statistics I've quoted are some of the quotes from the survivors that told their stories. For example, quote, I had called 911 before, but I was too scared to leave. I don't know what was going to happen to the dogs, and so I just sucked it up and kept going on. Another quote, the animals were a big part of why I didn't leave for the shelter. A really big part. I was their caretaker. They depended on me and supported me, and I didn't want to let them down. And finally, I went back to get the cats, and they had all been poisoned. Madam Speaker, the link between animal abuse and domestic violence is so profound that, in fact, it can be traced back in the history of some of the most heinous criminals that we have seen. And that, too, is documented here in this document. For example, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who admitted to 13 charges of murder or attempted murder, had previously abused his neighbor's Labrador Retriever, claiming that the dog was possessed and compelled to kill. Jeffrey Dahmer, who confessed to killing and dismembering 17 men and boys. As a child, he had impaled frogs, decapitated dogs, and staked cats to trees in his backyard. Those are things that should have been noticed. Those are things that should have been recognized. And clearly, this is an individual that needs help. And one has to wonder if help had been provided, if an intervention had been placed at a more appropriate time, if an intervention had been put in place, whether that had in fact would have made a difference. You know, I guess it's hard to say after the fact. You know, finally, Ted Bundy, who I think is a name that we all remember for terrorizing college campuses in the 1970s, and after killing 3 women at the Florida State University, and he is suspected of killing many, many more. During his childhood, he witnessed his father's brutality toward animals, and he himself tortured animals. So, Madam Speaker, you know, it's sometimes been said that if you can do something to an animal that's mean or harmful or abusive, in your mind, you don't recognize the separation between doing that to a human being. And I would only encourage our government, and I've spoken to some members about this, to look into some of what is going on in the City of Calgary and see if we can't expand it further across our province. Expand the working relationship between animal welfare, animal shelters, and animal welfare organizations, our police services, our social service agencies. I think we have to work with animal welfare agencies, our animal shelters, so that we can set up some form of cooperative agreement so that women and families fleeing domestic abuse situations can know that they can take their pets with them when they're fleeing that situation, and that that pet will then be cared for. And if it's not in the shelter, which I think is the ideal situation, because let's remember, pets provide a critical support to people that are going through really difficult times. At the very least, let's make sure that those pets could be housed, whether it be at nearby veterinary clinics or at or foster homes or at some other means. Because in a very effective public service campaign in the United States that showed a woman who obviously had been abused, and then in the other half of the poster showed a picture of a dog that had been injured, the caption beneath said, "She won't go back to save her toaster." But women do go back, and women put themselves at risk in order to save their pets. And recognizing and understanding how profound that linkage is, I think, is an important thing that we need to recognize and acknowledge in Alberta. And I think that one of the things we can be, and I mean, it was talked about here, I think, in the course of the last debate, but this is no different, where we can be leaders in recognizing that things don't exist in silos. And that if we work together across different jurisdictions and across different fields of expertise and fields of responsibility, that in fact we can do something that is beneficial for Albertans right across the board, but especially to try to address and recognize and hopefully provide some intervention that is helpful before someone becomes an abuser. I mean, ultimately, that would be our goal. Ultimately, it would be to recognize that what is going on here in someone's young life has the potential of spiraling into something much more grisly, much more heinous as they get older. So, Madam Speaker, I am very pleased to support Bill 2. I think this is a good piece of legislation. I'm glad that the government is bringing it forward, but I would encourage this government to go further. I would encourage this government, as opposed to looking at ways to remedy a situation that has already existed, I would encourage this government, whether it's the Minister of Social Services, whether it's the Solicitor General and Minister of Justice, whether it's the Health Minister for that matter, to work with authorities that have expertise in this area to recognize this vital link between animal abuse and domestic violence and recognize it for what it is, and recognize that we can make a meaningful difference in our society if we take steps to address these problems in their infancy before they spiral out of control. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Northwest, under Standing Order 29-2A.
I want to thank the member for Vermilion Lloydminster, and we have spoken, of course, about this very topic in the past, and I appreciate so much his compassion in this area. This is where, when we drop the partisanship and the name-calling, where we can work together and actually do great things. And the member actually said something that I thought was quite interesting, because I think it's really important for us to first of all consider what he said very seriously, to look at the fact that these markers are out there, to understand that the police know that these markers are out there, and we have the ability to use this as a tool to identify victims in situations where there is a potential to go in and offer help. But also to ensure that people who want to leave situations of domestic violence aren't prevented from doing so because they're worried about the vulnerability of their animals. And I want to ask the member, because you mentioned briefly the idea of perhaps housing pets at veterinary clinics. And as a veterinarian, I'm wondering if there is the potential to have a conversation with veterinarians across the province and find out if there is the ability to have a level of cooperation in ensuring some short-term care so that victims of domestic violence can leave and know that they have access to their pet even if the shelter they're in won't accept the pet.
Honourable Member?
Well, Madam Speaker, thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. And in fact, in some communities, that's already happening, which is certainly encouraging. After we attended this, after my wife and I attended this seminar last year, we actually called on the clinic that we used to be involved with and encouraged them to make that offer to our shelter in Lloydminster. You know, the one thing, of course, that we have to really worry about is that abusers are nefarious people. And if we put, for example, these animals in a shelter, and quite often shelters are run by volunteers, and if the abuser knows that that's the arrangement, the abuser can sometimes go in and say, oh, you know, that's my dog. I'll take him home now. He must have been a stray or whatever. And they have to have very careful training to know about the security that would be required. But, you know, I absolutely agree that if we can develop networks, whether it's through veterinarians, and I think the Alberta Veterinary Medical Association would be very open to this, but not only that, whether it be in private homes, in safe houses, if you will. I mean, that sounds incredible to even say that. But foster homes, temporary foster homes, where these pets could be housed. But again, I would really encourage our network of women's shelters, whether they are in primary or secondary level shelters, to consider providing for housing of pets, because again, the separation is one of the things that is an issue. And even if we house them in foster homes or in veterinary clinics, these pets are not with the people who not only they care for, the people care for them, but the pets care back for the people. And that support travels, of course, both ways. And so I think ideally we'd want these pets to be housed in the shelters, but if that's not indeed possible, then we should look for alternative arrangements and make that well known, so that women and children who are in these situations can know that they can leave safely and that their animals will be cared for. And that's certainly something that I would like to see in Alberta. I think that'd be a very positive development.